It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Anantanand Rambachan. Dr. Rambachan just recently retired and is Emeritus Professor of Religion at Saint Olaf College in Minnesota. He has been visiting professor at the Academy of the Study of World Religions at the University of Hamburg in Germany between 2013 and 2017. His scholarly interests include the non-dual Vedanta tradition in Hinduism, Hindu ethics, liberation theology, and interreligious dialogue. The British Broadcasting Corporation transmitted a series of 25 lectures on Hinduism by Professor Rambachan all around the world through the BBC. Professor Rambachan has been involved very deeply in interreligious relations and dialogue for over 40 years. As a Hindu contributor and analyst, he's active in interreligious dialogue programs of the World Council of Churches, the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue at the Vatican as well. He serves as the president of the board of the Arigato International New York, a global organization advocating for the rights of children and mobilizing the resources of religions to overcome violence against children. He is also co-president of Religions for Peace. This is an organization that I have had a chance to work with in the past and is really influential organization. In fact, it's the largest global interfaith network. Professor Rambachan has published many books, and his most recent book is Pathways to Hindu-Christian Dialogue, which came out this year. Professor Rambachan will be speaking on the topic of Hinduism and the common good, learning from Hinduism about the good life for all. He will speak to us until about 12:40, at which point we will open it up for discussion and your questions, and we will conclude our lecture today at 1 p.m. Please join me in offering a warm welcome to Professor Rambachan.
Thank you very much, Professor Meekham, and thank you, Sydney, for your wonderful words of prayer. Greetings, everyone. I am honored and grateful to be here. This is our first visit to Brigham Young University and to your state of Utah. And so I'm delighted and happy to be here with you. I'm grateful indeed to the David Kennedy Center for International Studies for extending this invitation to me to participate in your Fall 22 lecture series on the global religious experience. I'm really thankful to Professor Meekham for conveying your invitation to me and for all the wonderful arrangements for us to be here. My topic today is, as he said, is Hinduism and the common good, learning from Hinduism about the good life. Am I going to move these? Okay, there we go. So let me start with a broad observation about the religious tradition itself. So although the word Hinduism is in the title of my lecture, I want to clarify that what we speak of today as Hinduism is really a family of religious traditions. The name Hindu is geographical in origin. It is the Iranian version of the name of a river that we know today as the Indus River that flows in on the northwest corner of the Indian subcontinent, partly through Pakistan. So those who inhabited the regions drained by this river were sort of called Hindus. So it was originally used to say that these are the people living on the area drained by this river. I mention that because I want to flag the fact that those who lived in the territories drained by the Indus River did not share a uniform religious culture. And so today, the Hindu tradition reflects this astonishing diversity of language, culture across the Indian subcontinent and, of course, abroad. The world population of Hindus is estimated to be about 1.2 billion. 80% of India's population is officially classified as Hindu. And so I want you to think of the Hindu tradition as a large, ancient, extended family, recognizable through common features, but also reflecting the diversity of its individual members. Think of your own extended family. Secondly, this is a tradition that is highly decentralized. By a decentralized tradition, I mean a tradition that does not have a single person speaking authoritatively for all Hindus, or an institution, a single institution, managing and administering the affairs of the tradition. There are indeed shared teachings and practices, and I'll talk about some of these, but there's no insistence of uniformity even in these matters. There are teachings and beliefs, but no uniform creedal statements to which all Hindus must subscribe. So it's a tradition, as I like to say, that sort of a dynamic tradition of both diversity and unity. I often like to compare it to the banyan tree. I have an image there. The tree is diverse, it is interconnected, it renews itself while also maintaining a sort of a central identity. So having spoken of this tradition as one of unity and diversity, let me highlight something that is shared and central to everyone who regards himself or herself as belonging to this tradition. Although there are many great historical teachers in our tradition, the Hindu tradition is not established or centered around the life of a particular human teacher or a human founder. It understands itself to be based upon religious teachings. And the most central and authoritative scripture is the Veda. And the word Veda itself means teaching or knowledge. It comes from a Sanskrit root vid, which means to know. So the word Veda is knowledge. And these teachings are collected in 4 Vedas. And these are the collections of teachings that we regard as having the highest authority within the tradition. I think it is appropriate to describe the Vedas as revelation, because the orthodox Hindu view is that the teachings contained in these collections, each verse is called a mantra. You're familiar with the word mantra, I'm sure. Each verse is called a mantra, and these verses are believed by Orthodox Hindus to have been received. They were heard by inspired sages, inspired saints. In Sanskrit, they are called rishis, and they are the hearers of the mantras, which were memorized, preserved, and then transmitted across generations. So all Orthodox Hindus look to the Vedas as the high source of authoritative teaching in the tradition. And any tradition that wants to be considered orthodox will endeavor to show that its teachings are somehow in conformity with the Vedas. And this is usually done by the writing of commentaries on the text. I want to mention the final sections of each of these 4 Vedas. these are referred to as the Upanishads. And the Upanishads are dialogues between teachers and students, between gurus and their students. And these are the earliest and most important sources of Hindu theological thinking. So Hindus regard the teachings of the Upanishads, or that section of the Vedas, to contain its highest wisdom. And today I'll share with you many Upanishad texts. I also want to mention the Bhagavad Gita. And this is a dialogue also. A lot of our scriptures are in the form of dialogue. This is a dialogue between Krishna and his disciple and friend Arjuna. And this is also regarded as not as authoritative as the Veda, but certainly a very prominent and important sacred text in the Hindu tradition, because Krishna is regarded as an incarnation, or in Sanskrit we say avatar, a word you know very, very well from the film a few years ago. This is where it came from, avatar. There's a new one coming out in December, I believe. So where do we start? The Upanishads begin with the reality of God. In Sanskrit, the word that is used here is Brahman, the infinite, the limitless. And one of the most important, if I would say, definitions of the divine is my first text up there, that from which all beings originate, that by which they are sustained, and that to which they all return. A very basic, fundamental definition of the divine in the Vedas, coming from the Upanishads. So the Upanishads emphasize that God is one, and they emphasize that the existence of this one God before everything else, before the universe emerges. So here's another text. This is from the Chandogya Upanishad. So each dialogue has a different name. So the Taittiriya Upanishad is one dialogue, Chandogya Upanishad another dialogue in the Vedas. So in the Chandogya Upanishad, in the beginning this was being alone, or sometimes you could say truth alone, but speaking here of the infinite one. One only, without a second. Some say that in the beginning this was non-being, so the teacher is refuting an argument. Some say that there was nothing. And he's speaking to his students. There was non-being, one only without a second, and from that non-being arose being. But then he says, but how indeed, dear student, could it be so? How could being come from non-being? How could something come out of nothing, basically? The teacher is saying. In truth, in the beginning, there was being alone, one only, without a second. So this one being, this one divine infinite being, is the source of everyone and everything. God is not a national or a tribal deity of a particular religious or ethnic community, but the source of all life, the source of all existence. And the implication is that all beings belong to and constitute a single family. And I have a text here from Maha Upanishad. Those with small minds distinguish between the relative and the stranger. For those who live generously, the world is a family. So the Hindu tradition does not stop there, with God as the source, sustainer, and destiny of everything and everyone. Equally important, and I would say it's a sort of a non-negotiable teaching across Hindu traditions, is the affirmation that God exists equally in all beings. God exists equally in all beings. And here are two significant texts, one from the Bhagavad Gita and another one from a different Upanishad. One who sees the Supreme God existing equally in all beings, the imperishable in the perishable, truly sees. And the second text, this entire universe, this is the first verse of Isha Upanishad, this entire universe, moving and unmoving, is enfolded in God. Renounce and enjoy. Do not covet the wealth of others. So what we see here, for example, in the Bhagavad Gita text, is an emphasis on divine equality and divine inclusivity. God exists in all beings, as simple as that. This divine presence is an unqualified one. It is not limited by anything: nation, gender, ethnicity, age. The Isha text reminds us that nothing and no one is outside of God. Everything is enfolded. There's no existence outside of the infinite divine. Nothing exists separate from or apart from God. The word that is used here is beautiful: enfolding, Isha Vasyam, enfolding. Everything is enfolded in God. Points to a loving embrace, the preciousness of what is held together, like a child in the arm of a father or a mother. So the universe, in other words, is a sacred reality existing within the divine. What does this mean for us? What do we draw from this? This truth of divinity abiding equally in everyone is the most fundamental source and ground of the intrinsic dignity and equal worth of every human being. The value of the human being in this theological vision is not derived from the state, from government, nor is it reducible to economic or political considerations. It's an intrinsic dignity that flows from divine inclusivity, divine equality. So this is the source of human dignity. But what I want to emphasize is that while I speak of human dignity as an outcome of divine inclusivity and divine equality, for me, it summons something deeper. It summons me to what I can only describe as reverence. Not only dignity, but reverence for each other. And reverence, invokes the idea of sacred, of the sacred. So I would say that from a Hindu perspective, every human encounter is also an encounter with God, is also an encounter with the divine. In every face, we behold the face of the infinite divine. For good historical reasons, our contemporary discourse about the significance of human beings is dominated by the language of rights, of human rights. And I don't want to minimize the significance of that kind of political or social language, because it has brought us very far and given us legal grounds for contesting the abuse of human rights. But such language has its limits. It legally binds us perhaps to tolerance, but it does not awaken us to reverence for each other, or even for love for each other, which understanding the nature of God does. So this teaching is our antibody, if I might use that, a time when we think a lot about pandemic. It's our antibody to the instrumentalization of human beings and the denial of their personhood. We cannot, because of this fundamental affirmation that God exists equally in all, we cannot acknowledge and honor God while dishonoring and demeaning each other. It's just not logically possible. We cannot honor and value God and devalue human beings in whom the divine exists. We cannot give our assent, thinking of it broadly, we cannot give our assent or support to any social or cultural system that is founded on human inequality and indignity. To see women as inferior to men, to prefer the boy child, to mistreat the elderly, to ascribe unequal worth and to demean persons on the basis of birth, and to discriminate and to practice violence are all in fundamental contradiction to this theological affirmation. And let me say, in a spirit of self-honesty and self-criticism, that my own tradition has much work to do on this matter. The caste system, which is a hierarchical ordering of human beings into unequal groups, legitimized itself with appeals and interpretations of Hindu teachings. It divided people into four groups, unequal groups, differentiated on the basis of ritual purity and occupation. And in spite of the work of reformers, this system still persists. It's a subject to change, but it's still very much a part of the Hindu social order. It led to the creation of a large group of outcasts. Outside of the four castes, there were the untouchables, the outcasts, considered the lowest of the low, considered ritually impure, unequal, denied all the privileges and rights belonging to members of the upper caste. Exploitation of labor and limited access to material resources were greater as one went down this hierarchical order. Hinduism, like many other religions, developed in a patriarchal culture and still reflects in so many ways assumptions about male gender supremacy that are sources of oppression and suffering to women. So gender injustice still manifests itself in many ways in Hindu culture and practice, in preference for male offspring, in the stigmatization of widows, in the custom of dowry, which depletes the economic resources of families into which girls are born and make them feel guilty for the fact that they are women. So bridging this theological divide between ideal and social reality is a continuing challenge for my tradition that I want to acknowledge. I'll give you an example of what I mean. This bridging. I tell you a story about a great Hindu teacher. His name is Shankara, perhaps one of our most famous commentators on the Upanishads. But there is a story that one day, after taking a bath in the Ganges River in the city of Benares, he came out and he was going to his monastery. And in Benares, the lanes are very, very narrow. You can't walk by without touching shoulders with someone, and they're very crowded. So this great teacher, after his bath, was making his way. And you can see in the slides, he saw an untouchable, an outcast standing in the lane before him. And he's identified there because he has his dogs. And Shankara on the left is wearing his monastic clothing. And so fearing pollution from touching this outcast, and that's how we got the word untouchable. Because if you touch this person, you became impure and you had to go through ritual purification. He shouted from the distance to him, "Move, move," in a very authoritative, higher caste voice. But this man held his ground. And perhaps for the first time, this great teacher was challenged. The outcast held his ground and he said, "O great one among Brahmins," Brahmins are the upper caste, "what is it that you want to move? Tell me, what is the object of your verb? What are you asking to move? Are you asking this body, which is composed of the same elements as your body, to move? Is your object of your verb my body? But if so, what is it that differentiates my body from your body. We are all made of the same elements. Or perhaps, which is more important, or maybe you are asking the divine that you teach. So he was familiar. He said, the divine that you teach exists equally in all of us and is infinite, is present everywhere. Perhaps you are asking that divine to move, which is logically impossible. So please tell me, what is it that you want to move? And why are you asking? The point of his questioning is obvious. The story goes on to say that it was a moment of awakening for this great teacher. He bowed before the Untouchable and declared him to be, on that day, to be his guru. If, as this tradition teaches, this divine reality exists equally and identically in each of us, and we can't be separate from God by space or by time, what is our human problem? How do we characterize the fundamental problem? And here is where we come to something that is distinctive and important, and I think widely shared across Hindu traditions. They have consistently described this problem to be one of ignorance. In Sanskrit, the word for ignorance is avidya. Vidya is knowledge. When we put the negative we get its opposite, so it becomes ignorance. Under the condition of ignorance, we are not aware of the fullness of the divine in us, our lives, God in us, and us in God. We think of ourselves as existing independently and in isolation from each other and from the divine. And that's at the very heart of what avidya means. But describing this fundamental human problem as one of ignorance does not minimize its consequences. The outcomes of ignorance are grave and significant, and the Upanishads speak of these outcomes as the knots of the heart, and identifies 3 knots, like a rope into knots. And these are beginning with avidya, which is the first knot, and then you have the secondary knots, greed, and then greedful actions. Ignorance causes greed because it perpetuates a false belief that human beings can find lasting fulfillment in finite gains, in those things that are finite and unlimited. And so you have 2 texts. With wealth, you cannot make a human being content. And then one from the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. Only when people will be able to roll up the sky like a piece of leather will suffering come to an end without first knowing God. So under the condition of ignorance, in futility, we become selfish, we become assertive, we become greedy, we become violent. We create oppressive and hierarchical structures like those that I described, whether these are caste or patriarchy. A culture of greed leads to collective suffering, leads to exploitation of our earth. And the outcomes of greed are not only individual. These afflictions also extend to our collective identities as nations or corporations. I think when we think of the knots of the heart, we do have to extend our thinking, because greed also gets institutionalized in corporations. But wherever there is greed, there is never enough, and there is little concern for the common good. But there is optimism. In all of the traditions, it's an optimistic tradition. Ignorance can be overcome. And the overcoming of ignorance is what our traditions speak of as moksha. So the freedom from avidya is moksha or liberation. And you can see some texts. So moksha is an awakening to the reality of the divine. For those who see me everywhere and see all things in me, I am never lost, nor are they lost to me. The voice of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. Everything exists in me like jewels on a string. The best yogi is the one who sees others equally and who identifies with them in joy and sorrow. one who is without hate for any being, who is friendly and compassionate, non-possessive and non-egoistic, calm in joy and sorrow, and forgiving, is dear to me. So liberation or moksha does not isolate or alienate us from others, but draws us into the deepest unity which we can have with other beings. This is what these texts are highlighting. Through the one, we come to a place of unity. And so one of the important fruits of liberation, as you can see, is identifying with others, both in joy and in sorrow. And I always find it very interesting that in the Bhagavad Gita, when the best yogi, you're familiar with yogi because people are practitioners of yoga, but there he says the best yogi, the highest, is the one who identifies with others in their joy and in their sorrow, who has this deep sense of unity with others. This is not a passive identification, because we have many texts that speak of this identification as active. It is the rejoicing in the flourishing of other beings. It is compassion. The fruit of unity is compassion. And that's the last text I have there, is a description of the liberated person, one who is without hate for any being, who is friendly, who is compassionate, non-possessive, non-egotistic, calm, and forgiving. When liberation expresses itself in our actions in the world, when compassion flows from this inward state of freedom, it finds its expression in what our tradition, and in particular the Bhagavad Gita, speaks of as loka sangraha. It means, I'll spend a moment on that, the universal common good. The universal common good. And so two texts I have there, again the words of Krishna. Perform all actions with consideration for the universal common good. And that's the word loka sangraha. As the ignorant act from attachment to action, the wise should act without attachment, desiring the universal common good. Loka sangraha. So the common good becomes the measure of the meaning of right action. Does it in other words, we ask, not only does it serve my needs, but does it serve the needs of the community, the common good? And loka sangraha is a very inclusive word. It includes human beings, but not only. Loka is as broad as you can make it, the world of nature. It does not allow us to privilege unjustly the interests of any particular group or community. So the virtues have to be applied publicly for peace and for justice and for the flourishing of all. My time is fast moving, but I want to conclude at least with this point, a final word on this slide. It follows from everything that I've said, but I just want to emphasize it. Several Hindu texts, remind us that loka sangraha, the universal common good, includes the world of nature, the natural world. Our unity is also with that world. I just have one text again from the Mundaka Upanishad, which spells out beautifully everything that has come out of the divine. From him emerge the oceans and mountains. From him the rivers in their diverse forms flow. From him spring all trees and their sap, by virtue of which he abides in everything as the inmost self. And the point that I want to lift up and make is, and I spoke earlier about reverence, that we are invited to have that reverential attitude to the world of nature also. The value of nature is not merely instrumental to our own needs. And I know it has become, part of our contemporary rhetoric when we speak about sustainability and the necessity to restore ecological balance. In other words, our discourse is also very much anthropocentric. we have to save the earth because we have to save ourselves. Again, it's a hierarchical ordering in one way or another. And human selfish interest is indeed a valid cause for prudent care for the earth. But from a place of religious meaning, it still merely instrumentalizes the natural world for our purposes. The natural world has its own intrinsic value outside of human interests. And our needs cannot be the norm for measuring the value of everything. It cannot be, the value of the natural world cannot be measured only by what it contributes to our existence, because it's a divine gift. It has its own intrinsic value that comes out of that fact, out of that reality. We are not at liberty to destroy and recklessly exploit everything that we perceive as not necessary for our own prosperity. And so with that, adding to Sydney's beautiful prayer, I offer one from the Hindu tradition. This is part of our daily worship. May all be happy. Sarve bhavantu sukhina. May all be free from oppression. Sarve santu niramayaha. May all be filled with goodness. Sarve bhadrani pashyantu. May there be an end to all suffering. Ma kaschit dukhamapnuyat. Peace, peace, peace. Thank you very much, dear friends. I think I have faithfully observed my time limits. And I'm now open to your questions. Perhaps there was something that I didn't say about which you are more interested in than all of the things that I've said. So I am more than happy and willing to follow your questions and to humbly offer to you my own responses.
Thank you. Please join me in a round of applause. Thank you for those really marvelous remarks. We do have a traveling microphone, so if you do have a question, please just raise your hand and we'll get the microphone to you. When you do ask a question, please stand, share your name, if you're a student, what you study here at BYU, and we'll go until the top of the hour.
And please feel free to articulate your questions. I think we have one here. Yes.
Hi, I'm Melissa. I'm a media arts pre-major. So basically, I haven't gotten to the major yet. But I was just curious, you seem to have a lot of interest in Hindu and Christian interactions. Is there a certain experience or a reason that you've focused on Christianity? Or is that just like a recent thing and you've already focused on other religions? Just curious.
It's a very good question. Thank you for that. I think that there are reasons. I think I would start with my education. I grew up, my family roots are in India, but my wife who is here, and my wife and I grew up on a small island in the Caribbean, which is Trinidad and Tobago. And both of us, although we went to different schools, we both received our high school education at schools run by Christians on the island. And so we had both of us had a lot of exposure to the Christian tradition through our high school education. But we also grew up on an island that is a small island, but very diverse, where people of different faiths, live side by side. And in the village in which I grew up, we had Christian neighbors and Muslim neighbors, and of course, we were all Hindu families in that neighborhood. And I currently, as Professor Makam mentioned, I taught for 35 years plus at Saint Olaf College, which is also a liberal arts university affiliated with the Lutheran Church, and had my the cultural environment of my college was deeply informed by the Christian tradition. But what I want to, so all of these gave the Christian tradition a certain prominence and significance in my life. But I want to briefly mention, when I was a graduate student in England, I was invited to participate in an interreligious dialogue meeting in India. A Hindu-Christian dialogue meeting in India. And the topic was religious resources for a just society. Brought us a group of Hindus and Christians in a small village in North India to talk about justice. And that was a transformative experience in my life, a turning point in my life, where I came to the realization immediately that my life would be depleted in many ways if I did not expose myself more fully to other traditions, if I did not engage in learning about and learning from other traditions. Because I had never, growing up as a Hindu and higher education, until that point, ever thought seriously about justice. And the ways in which justice is important, and the ways in which the concerns with justice challenge my own tradition and challenge me. And so I never looked back, Alyssa. From that point onwards, interreligious dialogue became a central part of my life unto this very day. And I know that my own life as a Hindu would be lesser, much less, for the fact if I did not have the rich experiences of engagement and dialogue with people of other faiths, and in my case especially with members of the Christian community. So some of my longest friendships over decades are those with friends from the Christian tradition. And my last book, Pathways to Hindu-Christian Dialogue, is sort of an affirmation of the meaning of that for me. Thank you. Yes, at the back. And then on this end.
Hi, my name is Sydney Kimball, and I am a senior in sociology. You mentioned that every human encounter is an encounter with God, and I was just wondering if you had any insights on how to see God in human encounters that are filled with hate, discrimination, and harm to others.
Yes, it's a very good question. So I affirm what you said at the very beginning, that my tradition, I can't miss that. That teaching is so loudly proclaims itself from the Hindu tradition that the divine exists equally and identically in all beings. But there is a problem. We don't all know that. We're not all awake to that truth. And that's why I identified it as avidya. And because of that ignorance, and I emphasize also the grave consequences of that ignorance, which will include everything that you have said: hate, violence, denigration of others. That's also a reality. So we have these two realities, the reality of divinity existing equally in everyone, and then the reality of hate and violence and oppression, all of which I understand to be the consequences of ignorance. But that does not and should not stop me from still seeing the divine even in those who engage in these kinds of undesirable ethical behavior. Nothing, no unethical conduct is strong enough to erase the divine reality that is present in everyone. It may be clouded and shrouded and obscured, certainly by immoral behavior, but nothing can erase that reality. So even though I have to take my stand, and which I do, to forcefully oppose certain kinds of practices in the name of my own tradition identified, but I do that also with still seeing God in them, which enables me and is very important for me, which enables me to stand against them without hating them. I can oppose, I can resist, and I can stand against. And so, the fundamental, if you practice yoga, I'm sure you've heard the term in some other context. We greet each other with the word namaste. And when we do that, nama, the word namaste is composed of two Sanskrit terms, nama and te. Te means you, nama is to bow reverentially. So we greet each other, whoever it is, with the expression namaste. I bow reverentially to you, because I know that in you I'm also encountering God. It's one of the challenges of our times, isn't it? How can we stand firmly for what we believe in and for those higher values which you are championing, and to do so without hate? And I think, from my tradition, I have an understanding that enables me to do that. I constantly try to get better and better at doing it, because I realize it's not easy. It's not easy. Please understand.
Hi, my name's Ada Eber. I'm a philosophy major.
Yes.
I was just wondering, you were talking about how we can have freedom from ignorance.
Yes.
And I understand the whole aspect of that, but how does one truly internalize the fact of divinity in everyone? Because I could think that, but how do I really internalize that everyone in here has divinity within them?
Well, and that's one of the reasons why I told you the story of Shankara. He was such a great and famous teacher, but clearly he didn't internalize those teachings in such a way that it was transformative. So I hear you very clearly that theological insights matter most when they move, if I would put it, and sometimes the biggest distance is from the head to the heart, right? Even physically, we're very close organs, but there's a great gap. And that movement from the head to the heart is what I believe is transformation. So our religions work beautifully when our hearts are transformed. And so the theological teaching is the divine existing equally in all beings. And that assumes that I value the divine. That teaching doesn't matter unless I value God. And I am passionate. I'm passionate about the divine. But my love for God, it has a passionate character about it. And if I passionately love God, not with lukewarm emotions, but really with deep love, that has to transform my heart into a loving heart. Because, in our Hindu tradition, as with your tradition also, one of the core teachings is that divine is love. And you're familiar also, and I identify it because it resonates with me. One who does not love does not know God. So that God is love, and we who love God, our hearts are transformed by that love. And that love now has to flow outwards. And it flows outwards in our compassion, loving compassion for others, but also in work to transform structures. Structural forms of oppression. And I give two examples from my own tradition, caste and patriarchy, are structures. So that transformation cannot only be at the individual, interpersonal level. And that's part of the challenge that I see in my own tradition, that, even, in the earliest times, right on to medieval times, there was a lot of discussion about God existing equally in all, and the truth that continued to be articulated. But those who, on the basis of that truth, were speaking out against social oppression were very few. Somehow the connection was not always made, the transformative connection between this insight and what it means for our relationship with everyone in our community, for overcoming of caste, overcoming of patriarchy, overcoming of value for the male child above the female child, for contesting dowry practices and stigmatization of the widows and so on. So that's a lifelong process. Transformation is a lifelong journey. Yes, please, go ahead. We'll take 3. We'll start here, then behind, and then to my right.
Do you think that you, coming from Trinidad and Tobago, have a unique perspective in your Hinduism? Your ability to be honest and to speak truth to your Hindu, the structures, and to speak with perhaps about caste and about those kinds of things. I don't always hear that from the Hindu people that I talk to within India. That they're not as open to talk about caste as a negative. Sometimes I even hear them defending it.
Yes.
Do you feel like because you're a Hindu in diaspora that it's easier for you to talk in a critical manner about your own tradition?
Yes, thank you for that question. I would say in part, I'll say a little more, because my ancestors migrated to Trinidad in the late 19th century. And as a consequence of migration, many of the conservative aspects of caste fell. So under the conditions of life in Trinidad, because they came to Trinidad to take the place of liberated African slaves on the plantation. So they had to live. So once you had the emancipation in the 1830s, Africans on the islands of the Caribbean moved away from the plantations. So Indian laborers were brought to the island to take those places. So under the conditions of life on sugar plantations, many of the demands of caste could not obtain. Untouchability, hereditary occupation, rules of social dining, commensality, all fell apart. So yes, we grew up with very minimal consciousness of caste in our lives. So yes to your question. But I think in addition to that, I come back to the question that you asked me. Through that justice, interreligious dialogue that I took part in, the question of caste came. And if I didn't have all of the experiences of seeing my tradition through the eyes of others, because you don't often see your tradition as clearly sometimes in ways that you see it through the eyes of others. So I've had a blessing in so many ways of seeing my tradition critically through the eyes of others, and seeing especially what is oppressive about it, and learning to listen to those voices. That has also been very important to me in my ability, which I continue to work at, to be a spokesperson for justice, starting within my own tradition. As a result of which, I'm not always popular in my own. But I have found great sources of strength in many of my friends from other religious traditions who are working on similar issues. And sometimes those relationships are more inspiring and meaningful to me than even relationships within my own tradition. Behind, sorry, yes.
I'm Sydney, and I'm studying interdisciplinary humanities, but you talked about this distance between theological ideal and social reality.
Head and heart, yes.
Yeah, and often it's a chasm, not
It's a big one.
such a distance. I'm just curious where you would place generative interreligious dialogue. Is it when two devout religious people are talking about their theologies in the idealistic sense, or in the social reality sense, or in the liminal space between the two?
I believe, that's an excellent question. I believe that we can't separate them. If we focus only on dialogue, if you think of the word dialogia, on the words, on the exchange of words, which is often a very specialized kind of dialogue, we often end up, in my experience, speaking about religious ideals. And everyone speaks about the religious ideals of his or her own tradition in a very ironic way. But then we don't engage that chasm and interrogate ourselves. Well, if these are our religious ideals, why is it that social reality is in such contradiction with those realities? So, for example, again, I draw from my own tradition. If there is a meeting about the status of women, and you have Hindu participants, I guarantee you that you will hear at the very beginning that our tradition has not hesitated to image God as mother. We have feminine images of God, and in other words, we have no problem. Now, speaking an ideal. But what about, how does this ideal relate to domestic violence? How does this ideal relate to the fact that fewer resources are dedicated to educating girls? How does this ideal relate to the preference for the male child, and so on? So we cannot stop with the high level discourse, theological discourse about our traditions without interrogating also that relationship. And so that's why we need the voices. Again, our traditions all have histories, and those who are the religious authorities and spokespersons, say for example in the Hindu tradition, have always come from the upper castes, because these are the ones that had access to literacy and interpretation of the sacred texts and so on. So without the voice of those who are marginalized and those who have experienced oppression, they are not going to be challenged. They are not going to challenge themselves, because they enjoy the power that comes from holding on to those positions. So how do we ensure in a tradition that we lift up the voices and bring to the table of dialogue, to come to your question, those marginalized voices, to hear their powerful critique or their experience of the tradition? If I have never experienced my tradition as oppressive to me, I would think there was no problem. Right? And that's the reality for people who live on the higher levels of caste in their tradition. So we have to engage both of them. And that's a great need, at least for me. Last questions. Okay, good. And maybe I can talk to you afterwards. Yeah.
I'm Olivia. I'm a Middle Eastern Studies and Arabic major, and I just wanted to ask, what do you believe is one of Hinduism's greatest contributions to humanity as a whole? I would say a person. I would say Gandhi, and his lifting of the ethic of non-violence, ahimsa. Prior to Gandhi, the teaching on non-violence or ahimsa was largely
interpreted as an interpersonal virtue. People practice it as an interpersonal virtue. He was the first, at least within the Hindu tradition, and some would say even on a global level, to lift the significance of ahimsa or non-injury from the interpersonal sphere to make it into a mode of social resistance. That love became a social virtue that could be used for challenging oppressive structures. In his case, it was largely in his struggle against British colonialism, but his efforts were wider than that. So, I can give more thought to your question, but this is the one that answer that pops up for me, because I think, and I say that to you because I think Gandhi was inspirational in igniting struggles across the world in his time, based on, even right on to the present time, non-violent struggles of various kinds were inspired by his example. So I think he's a gift. Unfortunately, this is part of our problem right now. It's a big challenge in India with the rise of Hindu nationalism, and part of that nationalism is the marginalization of Muslims and Christians who are experiencing increasing violence in India. That marginalization has also extended to Gandhi. And you may not, it may be surprising or perhaps not surprising, but there are lots of Hindu nationalistic voices today in India who are granting heroic status to Nathuram Godse, who was the assassin of Gandhi, and calling for celebration of his birth date as a national day of celebration. And you have with national Hindu nationalism is also causing the negativization of Gandhi's status in India and his contribution. We couldn't get into that in today's lecture, but that's another significant issue for us in the present time, that there are interpretations of this tradition today that are leading increasingly to the marginalization of other traditions in India, and the clamoring for a state that privileges Hindu identity above all others. I write about this, and I develop a critique of it based in, because you have to criticize it also from within the tradition. How is this interpretation of Hinduism antagonistic and a betrayal also of its core teachings? It's an important development, and I think it's going to be a really serious challenge for the tradition in the coming years. How do we deal with this nationalism, and what is the implications for India and the diaspora as well, because its tentacles are also spreading here in the United States, in England, where we had some violence recently in the city of Leicester between Hindus and Muslims, and in other parts of the world. Thank you.